Nicholas McCarthy, filmmaker, archivist, historian, and enthusiast, is joining me on Craig and Friends. Welcome, Nicholas.
I'm very happy to be here on your very cool podcast, Craig. It's good to meet you.
Thank you so much, and it's lovely to meet you as well. And it turns out we have shared, not shared history necessarily, but shared locations, in that you grew up in Massachusetts.
Yeah. Is that where you are now?
Was it the wood paneling that gave it away? It was,
Yes.
Wasn't it? Yeah. It's requirement when you live here for any period of time or visit. You got to do this. I'm actually visiting for a while, staying here while my spousal visa is in process.
Oh, right on. Yeah, I grew up in New England, and all my sort of movie memories were formed in the Boston area, which was an amazing time to grow up in as a kid in the 1980s, because there was just, there's always been an incredible film scene in Boston. And then, when my family moved there when I was 10, there was probably a half dozen different revival film theaters that were showing a different double feature every day. I think the month that I moved there, I snuck off to see by myself Nosferatu, the Herzog's Nosferatu. My parents still don't know about that.
Do you think it's safe to tell them at this point on that one?
I might.
Okay.
In maybe my last moments on Earth, I'll finally confess this. But yeah, I love the Boston film scene. Was great. The first couple movies that I made to these indie horror films, I got to play at the Coolidge Corner Theater, I grew up in walking distance of it. So yeah, all of my sort of formative memories about films were because of the theaters there, but also because of Boston area television, UHF.
Yes.
All the films that they would show on late night TV or on Saturday afternoons. Those were like some of the most important things that I ever encountered,
Well, same here. And they would give you access to things that maybe you were hunting for and could not find. One in particular on Channel 27, from which you have some bumpers that I'm going to have to press you for later on from your archives. I saw the Johnny Rotten Harvey Keitel film, Corrupt, a.k.a. Cop Killer, a.k.a. four other things. Yeah. Now it's been issued on Blu-ray, I think by Vinegar. I'm not sure. But then it was like hunting and hunting and hunting. It was a 4 a.m. showing. I stayed up, and then somehow it didn't tape. So, no, that was when I set the timer. But they showed it again, and you could see these things uncut. That was another, I think, critical thing to this area in the UHF stations.
Yeah, I haven't, it's not like I've done a deep dive about that world, and I'm sure, it's waiting for me on the internet. But I have this recollection of, Channel 38 would have the movie loft.
Yes, with Dana Hersey.
I mean, it was such an odd thing. It's a local, TV slot that is like sort of couched with this sort of, let's talk about movies seriously, right. And that was a sort of culture, I think, back then, which was the idea of the film buff.
Yes.
It was sort of highbrow, and of course, very sort of collegiate Boston, and also, because there was such a serious interest in film there, they would show stuff uncut. I remember they showed The Deer Hunter uncut, which is insane. But also I remember they showed Channel 38. They showed Friday the 13th, the first one, uncut. They must have taken the nudity out of it, but I remember seeing those gore effects like on my family television.
One wild one, and I still haven't seen it. But I know about the contents. They showed Straw Dogs completely uncut.
God,
and I don't think at like 3 a.m. either. It was a movie loft presentation.
It was for like kids on Saturday mornings or something.
Yeah, that's when they played it. That's right. Yeah. And then 27, of course, Movies Till Dawn, which is the place where I saw In God We Trust. Have you ever seen that Marty Feldman movie?
Yeah, I know the poster and, of course, his face with it, but I've never seen In God We Trust.
It's kind of fascinating. Once I get all my stuff out of storage over in the other land, in the Big Smoke, I'll have to send it to you because Richard Pryor is in it. Marty Feldman wrote, directed, and starred, and Andy Kaufman plays a televangelist.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty major. I think it's influenced probably about 2 people in the film business.
But it's interesting how, just like you say, discovering that stuff. I mean, I'm always a bit self-conscious talking about how I encountered films as a kid because I don't want it to come off as like, well, in my day,
Right.
when that is, of course, exactly what I'm doing. But there really was this different, sort of feeling you had about movies when they not only like you had to hunt for stuff, but also you just found stuff you didn't know anything other than the video box or when there was a listing for a film
Yeah.
on Channel 27. And that's how I made that tape of Zontar, the thing from Venus. And I think Zontar I probably had read about in the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film, but just as a blurb. And I had to set, the timer on the VCR.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something about this idea of this sort of, Videodrome is kind of a movie that captures this moment in time when there's the idea of like a video signal could sort of invade your home and you might be exposed to something. And that's how I felt about Zontar, which was, I watched that tape over and over, because there also was this sense that maybe you would never get to see it ever again. This was the only chance.
Well, when Corrupt failed to tape, I was just devastated. And then I was poring over the listings, as one would do. I don't know if it was TV Guide or the local TV listings, which for folks that aren't of our vintage, was something that was published quite extensively or thoroughly and regularly. So I saw that there was another taping at 4 a.m., so I just stayed up until I could hit record and then fade out. And then I'm sure woke up and then watched it immediately, being a huge Johnny Lydon fan.
That's amazing. I have seen that movie, though. It's been about 30 years.
What'd you think of it, by the way, before we move on? I'm always curious.
It's 30 years. I remember just being very interested in it. I think I saw it at that time in my life. I was in my 20s when I was just seeing everything. I would spend my summers in Boston, at my parents' house when I was going to college, and Tower Records at the top of Newbury Street had this deal where it was like $1 rental for on I think Tuesdays and Wednesdays or Mondays and Tuesdays or something. And so I would take home 3 movies a night and then of course be going to see movies during that. And so I think it was during that period when I literally was watching hundreds of films in a year. So the short answer is I don't remember, but I remember thinking it was interesting.
Well, that's a great era in life. And sometimes I wonder, how come I haven't watched a movie in X number of days? I don't know if it's sort of the time bifurcation, TikTok and checking messages and then preparing content and all that. But I think there is a need to sort of enforce the watching habits that I would like to have. But also there was the accidental discovery, which I think is something that it's easy to avoid these days, but I strongly suggest to everyone listening who probably does this anyway to just go ahead and try anything, at least for 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. And I think actually now that, just looking at keyframes on Tubi or whatever, there's so many sort of, there's so much content that's there that you really can have your sort of mind blown when you have no context. That's sort of it's sort of a that was sort of a whole thing about, and I know we'll talk about the podcast in 2 seconds, but that was sort of what I wanted to sort of paint as the sort of background of how I encountered this movie, Student Confidential, was this, that before the internet, there was a lack of context that you'd regularly, as a film fan or even as a music fan, how many records did I buy because someone told me it was good, not because I had heard it,
Or Rolling Stone's Top 100 list, which was actually extremely, extremely valuable back then.
Yeah, I did the same thing. And that's how, there was a whole bunch of records that I just knew the covers of because of that. And I actually remember, and again, we have to stop this back in the day, and maybe this will be the last back in the day story. But
in a certain era, we can just say in a certain era that we lived through.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Well, we suffered. How about this? We suffered, and thank God for now.
Yeah, but here's the thing: it's we suffered, but Craig, how much do you romanticize those memories? I had one friend who also was into rock music, and I worked at a bookstore for a year, and I stole the book that was the 100 Rolling Stones 100. Our 7 white male critics say these are the 100 best rock albums of all time.
Yeah,
and this was the first time I'd ever heard of the Velvet Underground. And and was like, where do you get this record? And
Right.
then my friend found the live Velvet Underground album, not Max's Kansas City, but the Live in '69 album at the library, like some hipster librarian. And we took it out of the library and listened to it. And it was like, this is the point, I guess, is that when there's that scarcity,
Yeah.
you really pay attention. Like you pay close attention, right? Whereas it's very easy to sort of, when there's an embarrassment of riches, to say, because what is it like when we sit down to watch something? It's like, okay, am I going to watch the greatest documentary of all time, or am I going to watch the greatest streaming series of all time, or am I going to watch one of the greatest films of all time? Like we are faced with that choice every night, and
and sometimes those decision-making processes take up more of the time and occasionally eat up all the time.
Yes. Oh my God. Well, now, I think the solution that I have for that is like, if I'm going to watch a movie, I decide what movie I'm going to watch that day. And it's like, and I can't change from that because I'll be paralyzed otherwise.
I do that too. Although I went through the HBO Max A to Z, although they've changed it around. You can only do it on the HBO thing. But I made my list, and some of them, there's actually a lot of documentaries, and I want to watch more narrative stuff. But the Faye Dunaway documentary, I'm going to have to watch that.
Yeah.
But the random discovery, particularly in the era that we were talking about, is what led you to Student Confidential, aka The Counselor, almost a mythic film for a long time for you. But not only did you learn everything behind the scenes, you're now sharing this with everyone and shepherding the film. Hopefully. I don't know, because what happens in the end of the podcast, but it's already out. So you decide. You tell me how much we want to reveal, but want to give just a description of the film.
Yeah. Well, the Vanity Project podcast it's a 6-part documentary series about this movie, Student Confidential, that I saw at an all-night movie marathon in October of 1988 when I was 17 years old. I was living in my first apartment after moving out of my parents' house, and just a movie obsessive. And this film was shown in the middle of this all-night movie marathon. It was a then new film. It was billed as the New England premiere. There was about 2 sentences written in the program guide about it. And it was clear that the programmers had never seen the film. And what I learned later is they'd never even watched the movie as it played in the theater. And what it was a movie that Troma had picked up and marketed as a sort of traditional sexploitation film. But that's not what emerged on screen at, 7 o'clock in the morning to a bunch of, probably high college kids, which was, the movie is this very sincere feeling, kind of after school special vibe, about this counselor helping this group of troubled kids. But the story slowly becomes more about the counselor and his problems that sort of eventually climax in him putting a gun to his head. And the crowd that morning, they were stirred into kind of a state of hysteria as I watched this movie, because it was so odd. Every sort of turn of the story, it got more and more bizarre, and not in an intentional way, and in a way that was so both confusing and enchanting. Because I think if you take if you look at Student Confidential from about 100 feet away and squint, it kind of looks almost like a normal movie. But the choices of whoever the people who were making this movie, and we didn't know as it was on screen, were so strange. And by the end of the film, people were literally standing, screaming at the screen.
Wow.
And so the movie finished, and the last credit that rolled up, it's literally the last credit. I think there's a block of extras that are listed by name after it, which is another peculiar thing. Because how many movies that you see that actually list the names of all and if you look, all the kids entered fake names too, and somehow. But the last, official credit in the crawl, it says, written by, produced by, directed by, edited by, music composed by, music performed by, and then, as it turns out, starring as the counselor, Richard Horian. And that was the moment when I just knew that not only had I seen something really special, but that I needed to find out who this guy was. And the story of this, this documentary series, the podcast, is about this sort of 35-year journey of slowly piecing together. Of trying to find out who he was and who he is, because I did find him, and it led me to this place that I absolutely could never have imagined, which was that I became the one person who was who could save this movie from oblivion, that he wished to have this film destroyed, and I was trying to save it from Richard, the guy who I saw up on screen back in October of 1988. So yeah, that's the Vanity Project. And Student Confidential is just it's a movie that, while it never was, it's an incredibly obscure film. It's not lost, or it was not lost. Troma put it out on VHS and then in a horrible DVD edition. So it was around. I mean, you could look on eBay and find the DVD for like $9, people selling the VHS for maybe $13. It's just that it was one of these films that no one knew about, except for sort of basically two kinds of people, either exploitation film completists or Troma film completists, an even smaller niche of people. And so if you go on Letterboxd, it's, the people who watch every obscure movie were the people that would rate this film. And, when Letterboxd became a thing, and I would sort of, because I was always tracking this film, like for decades, the common theme in the Letterboxd reviews was, who's the psychopath that made this movie? And then the next review would say, did a psychopath make this movie? It was like that word keeps coming up. And in one of the most recent reviews, actually, someone said, someone has to find out who made this movie. And that really is how it feels when you watch it, is that knowing that Richard was the person who this is his, he did everything on this film, and he's the center of attention in it. You can't but help wonder why. Right. And I'd like to think I answered that question.
Well, you did, and very thoroughly. Also, in addition to the inherent fascination with the quest, spurred by your fascination of the film, it's incredibly touching. I cried, actually, in the last episode, hearing his reaction to a number of things. And I don't want to spoil stuff, so you let me know if anything I say should be omitted. But when you finally break through to him and you get through that, I guess, shell that's been hardened over the years by disappointment, what I imagine to be almost daily self-flagellation, as sort of hinted by or suggested by how he treated his second film, and to crack through that and provide him with the validation that, I don't know if he was seeking that when he made it. I think he was just trying to express himself, but something that was so distant from him and impossible to get. And you provided that, out of a genuine love. And at a certain point, when you say, we did it, and he says, no, you did it. After watching the movie, I thought, this is him. This is the guy. And when people said psychopath, I thought, he's on the spectrum. When I was watching it after that, I thought, he's on the spectrum, and desperately wanted to connect, to the point that he made not just this film, but he made an album before this in the late 70s called Relationship.
Yeah. And that the project of Student Confidential, the project of the concept album Relationship, which is, it's an album that takes you through the different stages of relationship to help guide you and understand you, how you can have a complete bond with another person. His second film, which is Lost, called Williamstown, there's copies you can see of it, but it's the film elements are gone, is about his character yearning for the love of the love of his life, who's a ghost. And this is, it's Richard's sort of obsessive subject, if it's like, that is his, if there was a book written about him, and I guess I wrote it in the podcast, that's like, his auteurist sort of point of view is to sort of, to always come back to this image, this idea of trying to reach out and connect with another. And yeah, I did feel like once I identified that with him, and absolutely, once I got to know him, realized that, and this is talked about in the podcast, that, his sort of neurodivergence, he's diagnosed with clinical depression. I think it created a situation where he really has a sort of genius brain in terms of just his ambition to create things, to make things. And the fact that he could make these movies with his own money. He was not a rich kid. He earned all this money inventing things and selling the patents to major corporations, and then also flipping some houses, I think, as well. But he's obsessed with money. By the way, as a lot of film obsessives are, there's a lot of film obsessives in the financial world, was what I've learned. But Richard took this, I think, feeling that he had of disconnection, and tried to instill it in his work. And so, yeah, I did feel that once I sort of suss this out like that, and I tell him directly, that this is, my project here with this series is not only to sort of tell this incredible story, but to sort of take this image of this movie, this idea that here's something that you might laugh at. And the closer you look at it, the more you realize that not only did a human being make this, but it's a human being who's honestly trying to express something beautiful and human, and something that I think any of us could identify with, because to me, Richard has that, he, in his, the sort of poles that he navigates between, of being someone who very much is an extrovert, and you see that on screen with the counselor, someone who is the business genius, who's helping people, who has all the answers. And then there's something else inside of him, which is that person who only sees himself as a failure, who feels like people don't really know him. And I'm like, hey, everyone feels that way, Yeah. And I think Richard beautifully sort of expressed that in his work. And it took this whole journey to not only track down the other movie and the album, and then extensively interview him to really get to that core. So yeah.
Well, I think it's a really beautiful thing that you've done, and of course it's born out of obsession. But one could say so is Richard's entire work, and not just with the film or with the album, but his obsessive analytical genius and imagination is what led him to do these other things. And that's reflected in the character once again, because it's made very clear at the beginning that he is a business genius. So why is he doing this? Why does he want to be a counselor to troubled kids? And his wife says it in a very unpleasant way.
Yeah.
But even that relationship is clearly born out of, okay, so how do you make a relationship? How do you have a wife? How do you have a successful life? And that's the part that led me to sort of believe on the spectrum. And of course, you can't diagnose someone, but my partner is autistic, and there's certain things about the breaking down of relationships or other things, which works beautifully in some areas, and in other areas are not just challenging, but can lead to feelings of defeat. So I want to commend you on giving him the feelings that you hear in the podcast. And let me say, the Vanity Project is one of my favorite podcasts that I've heard recently. And anyone who's into docu-series or film, it's a quest. Even if you're not a film nut, the story itself carries on.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. Like when I, so to get it made, because I never, I'm not a documentarian, right? I am now, I guess, but this was the only time I've ever done anything that's like nonfiction. I write and direct horror films. To how I sort of explained it, I remember to David Gregory, who's one of the founders of Severin Films, who helped me in the search to actually get the film elements for Student Confidential. Is I told them, what I want to do is I want to make something that's like if the New Yorker had an article about Andy Milligan movies. I want this to be something pitched to the normies so that they,
right.
Because at the end of the day, like those of us who are deeply connected to films, like I think we all understand our very complex relationship with movies, that like, especially the kind of films that like I listened to your episode on Eyes of Laura Mars, and the way you guys are talking about it, it's precisely sort of how I sort of navigate, interact with that movie, which is that there'll be a moment when I am laughing at the movie empirically because there's something ridiculous. And then at the very same moment, I am in absolute aesthetic awe of what I'm seeing because it is beautiful. And then in that same beauty, I am seeing something ridiculous.
Yes.
And I think in a way, the reason why I think Student Confidential became a sort of touchstone for me is because the deeper that I went with it, the more human and humane I saw that it was inside of all the ridiculousness, and so for the podcast, I wanted to hopefully in some ways shed a light on why any of us would have such a deep connection with fringe films, because at the end of the day, and again, we're preaching to the choir here, but the movies in some ways that are the most sort of fringe or dog-eared, and especially like a lot of sort of super low budget movies.
Yeah,
it's just by virtue of the fact that there's fewer people that are working on it, that there's fewer checks and balances. There'll often be just more humanity, and there will be more of this documentary quality that so much of us love about watching any kind of older film, which is that every film is a documentary about it being made, right? And some of the issue becomes with the more money that they had to make a movie, the more they're actually going to try to hide what real life was like.
Right. Cover the mistakes and paper over the cracks.
Yeah. And it's like one of the reasons why, like, when in New Hollywood, when they would be shooting in, the films in New York, when there were these New York movies in the 1970s, there was this, beautiful combination of this new realism, but then also that there literally wasn't any money to make movies back then. They just they didn't have enough money to do the things that maybe they would have wanted to. And so all of a sudden you get something really beautiful because it maybe even accidentally captures something they didn't intend. So all of that, that sort of deep relationship with especially exploitation movies, but any kind of fringe movies, I wanted to sort of try to paint that picture inside the series. That was the sort of way in. And it's funny because when I said that to David Gregory about it's like a New Yorker article about Andy Milligan. I mean, I think he was completely confused because he's inside this world where Severin is like it's almost like a closed bubble in a beautiful way, where it's like David and his partner Carl, and they have all these great employees. They're like, every one of them that I've met are amazing. And they have like these rabid fans. I'm one of them. And it's sort of like, to the rest of like sort of mainstream, it's like, fuck off. We just want to watch like our weird Black Emmanuel movies, like it's like, and, but at the same time, I always love this idea of being able to sort of lure people into understanding what is maybe so special about our connection to the cinema, Yeah,
absolutely. And by the way, thank you for what you said about that episode. And I love that. That is, as you could tell from the episode, and people who listen know, that is the magic of it, because, there is something great in almost every movie, unless it's a very earnest nonsense movie that's sort of meant to push something, like those movies, and was it the 80s and more the 90s, where it's like something bad happens to a very rich man who's very successful. William Hurt can't speak, so he's going to have a chalkboard around his neck, and through that he learns the value of relationships, whereas this is a far more affecting story. If you have the strings washing over and it's like, or that awful Nick Cage movie, I think Family Man, where the message is, when you're poor, you're more of a real person. Made by people making millions of dollars. So,
Right, yeah.
and sometimes the more confused the film is, or at least maybe we can see it as confused, or we're confused by it, I think is the better way to put it, the more it can challenge you, or even just sort of stir something up in your mind. And it doesn't have to be the best movie. And in certain ways, this is not that much different than a Cassavetes film.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, wildly different in a lot of, let's say, variables. But the fact that it's someone wanting to make a film so badly that they sell their very successful organizations and move to LA and pursue this thing with a determination that, again, only an obsessive can. And it's not an easy thing now, and it certainly wasn't then.
Yeah. It's funny. You remind me too of like that idea that there's supposed to be sort of rules around movies. Like, there was an interview I once saw with Seymour Cassell where he was talking about how he was on the set of John Cassavetes' first movie, just observing in like an apartment where they were shooting. And he, and this is like in New York City in, 1959. And he spoke to Cassavetes afterwards and said, well, this is great. I've never seen like a movie being made. And I guess Cassavetes said, well, this is how we're making a movie,
Yeah.
So he was aware that like, it's like, well, this is all I have. And I just know I'm going to get to this place, and that is like what, sort of Richard, was doing, where, for someone who had literally never written a screenplay, directed even a short film, or acted, been in front of a camera before, it's remarkably competent, this movie.
Yeah.
I think he knew probably when to listen to the people that he had surrounded himself with. But I should say that sort of broken quality you're talking about, of like sometimes when the film is confused, there's actually something more humane about it. I think that's one of the reasons why, like, kind of film nerd culture, I mean, whatever that means, I think one of the reasons why people who are sort of obsessed with more fringe movies, with exploitation films, with, instead of the greatest thriller from the late 70s, they're obsessed with The Eyes of Laura Mars. It's that the films, by being imperfect, they feel like you're actually meeting a real person. Like if every movie in some ways is a voice, should be a voice, that you're actually meeting someone who's more a reflection of yourself in their imperfections, it's sort of like you go to the pound and, like, let's say like you're determined to like adopt a dog, and there's two dogs there and one of them is a three-legged dog. I'm going to adopt that three-legged dog. That's the one that I want to love more. And in some ways, even though there are lots of beautiful, amazing classic Hollywood films that I love, at the end of the day, the ones that sort of speak to me the most are actually, they're B-grade movies, movies that are sort of crummy or falling apart, or just some of them just being openly fiascos or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's a reflection in some ways of just like, I feel the humanity in those movies,
I do, even with something like a movie I love that some friends of mine refuse to watch, Cop and a Half, with Burt Reynolds and Ray Sharkey.
I refuse as well. No, I don't want to watch it with you, Craig. No, I'm just joking.
No, I want to do a movie club on it. I think my friend Phil from the Making Tarantino podcast is going to do it. I tried to get two other people, and they just said absolutely not. And I thought, you're missing out. It's one of his best films. It's actually affecting, and there's nothing about it on paper that would make you believe that it would be. Also directed by Henry Winkler, and a totally inappropriate scene in it that I won't divulge now. But yes,
now I really want to see it.
See, there you go. And that's an example of what I try to do, and you're referring to, is what's going to give the little hook to someone where that, like, maybe someone thinks that they wouldn't like this, and maybe they won't, but give it a chance. And here's why. To look outside of, let's say, the canon, particularly of like film bros, this guy is the best. If it wasn't that, it's not good. Oh, and if this is considered a remake, like I heard someone outside a screening of Sorcerer going, well, what did you like better, Wages of Fear or Sorcerer? And I said, I didn't see Wages of Fear. And he goes, oh, it's much better. And of course it is, right? Of course it is, because you're a contrarian. And I thought maybe I'll see it someday, but I'm a huge Friedkin fan. So did he make Wages of Fear? Not that one.
At the end of the day, it's easy to get caught up in, and we're all sort of some ways helpless to it. This idea of like high art and low art culture, and that's why like it kind of feels like, it's like that there's probably a contingent of people who just like would not understand what it is that you see in a sort of broken or more fringe movie. But I don't know, it's sort of like films, they end up being like old friends, like the ones that you keep going back to. And it's difficult in some ways to sometimes even articulate why that is, because there's so many different reasons for it. I know for me, like, a lot of the movies that I go back to again and again, they're not the greatest movies, but there's something that's good about them that makes me feel comforted, like, so I grew up, watching Channel 56, the Creature double feature, and in those movies, when I was a kid, I encountered those films first only by title, because until I was about 9 or 10 years old, my family lived in New Hampshire, and we did not get Channel 56 in on our black and white TV. Okay. That's how little my parents valued, like, to them it was like television, like, and certainly there was no VCR or anything. I actually saved up money, with my first job babysitting, to buy a used VCR that I found. Like that's how much I wanted to watch, movies.
That's a lot of babysitting, by the way, not to interrupt. Sorry, but
and actually, to my father's credit, I think he paid for half of it or something. It's like
at a certain point when parents go, I don't get this, but like he's saving this money for this thing. He really wants it. Clearly, let's just speed the process along. Yeah,
it's what it was like when it was like there was like a something called the want advertiser, I think, and it was like this. It was these listings of like people selling. It's like what Craigslist is now, and there was a guy selling, and it was like $200 for this VCR or something. I had saved up like $100 or something like that, because everything was so fucking expensive back then. It's like, in terms of talking about like home video equipment was expensive.
Oh yeah,
it really meant like it was like a piece of furniture you were buying.
Yeah,
it was an appliance.
They were about as heavy as well. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, it was like a brick, and it was a top loader and everything, but. God, I have such great memories of that thing eating my Hellraiser tape, But the first kind of horror movies that I encountered were these movies that they were showing on Channel 56. But for about a year, and this is when I was about 8 years old, I would read in the TV listings. It wouldn't say Creature double feature. It would just list these two movies, because
right.
Creature double feature was like from 1 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was like at 1 o'clock, it would say, Godzilla versus the Smog Monster. And then it would say, starting at 2:30, and it would say, destroy all monsters. And I would like read that as an 8-year-old. And it's like, what does this mean? Like it's a movie called Destroy All Monsters. Like this is a whole, we're deep into a story at this point. If the monsters exist, and now we're going to have to destroy them. And so what happened was, it must have been, it was at the top of the year, we got in Channel 56. They must have boosted their signal. And so all of a sudden we got in this new UHF station, if we tuned the antenna just right. And so I waited all week, and I don't remember the very first one. It was a Toho Godzilla movie, but the second movie they showed was a film called Frankenstein Meets the Space Monster, which is an amazing, still not on Blu-ray, and it should be. It's an amazing black and white, early to mid 60s, very fringe, kind of regional, I believe mostly shot in Puerto Rico, horror film, not about Frankenstein's monster. It was about an out of control robot named Frank. And then we're cutting to this stuff that plainly was shot because they didn't have enough footage for the rest of the movie of these two space aliens that kind of look like, one of them kind of looks like Vampira, and then the other kind of is like almost like Tor Johnson, but with these big ears. They're sort of like Grandpa Munster or something, commenting on the action. And there was like surf rock, and there was this very violent scene where the robot attacked someone on the beach with a hatchet. And my like 8 or 9 year old self was so confused and transfixed.
Yeah.
Because at that age, you don't have the language for something being, bad the way that the sort of conventional norms are around films. It was just this kind of, dog's breakfast of elements. Like it was like something really shocking, like that hatchet murder, and then something really ridiculous, like these two aliens commenting on the action, and then like stuff like there's like a whole sequence of them just like driving around a moped in Puerto Rico that just goes on forever. Like, and it's like, and the way that you interface with something like that as a kid is like, you just accept it all. And that was really the moment for me when the floodgates then opened, that there was this whole world of the cinema that I had to know everything about. And in some ways, just to bring it back to the podcast, 10 years later, maybe 7 or 8 years later, that whole obsession was just part of that, of just trying to see everything I could. And it was all the concentric circles attached to that. Like, it was like, okay, this is a horror film, so I'm going to rent another horror film, but this is actually a regional picture that was shot in, it was a movie shot in Florida. Oh, but there's this sexploitation movie shot in Florida that Doris Wishman did, and I'm going to see that. Like, and you just start to sort of, and it leads to, like, that's how I saw my first art films. That's how I also went back and watched classic Hollywood films, was first being interested in really fringe things, and then realizing that all these things were connected in some ways,
Sometimes we're pulled to the high art by the low art. And of course, to paraphrase Brian Ferry, high art, low art, I'm interested in those. It's the stuff in the middle I can't stand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like The Family Man or The Doctor.
But well said. Yeah. Funny.
And, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, that growing up, and it doesn't exist so much now. It does to a certain extent, but when I was a kid, those ideas of high art and low art were really sort of baked into popular culture, like now, there's, it's like A24 and neon. Like, it's like, my daughter, when she was like 11 years old, was like, knew what an A24 movie was. It's like this idea of like that, horror could really speak to you, when I saw Suspiria at the Somerville Theater, by myself, when I was about 15 years old, it absolutely transformed my life, seeing that film. And I was all by myself. And that to me was still one of the greatest films I've ever seen, and one of the best film experiences I've ever had. And that was like, would be considered a fringe horror film to the vast majority of people. But to me, that was something that was like this incredibly moving, poetic, and genuinely frightening experience. That has become, those ideas, as everything has become mainstream because of the internet, are not so surprising anymore. But when you're growing up in an environment where, if I was to bring that up to sort of normal people, they would think there's something wrong with me. You sort of have to fight through, like, you keep it to yourself, and then you have to find your tribe,
Right. Yeah, because you do get that pushback, which also, just like the hardened shell of Richard through the rejection, it's not quite the same, but you just go, okay, I know my aesthetic, and I'm not going to listen to anyone else who tells me that this is bad. Matter of fact, if I hear a bunch of people talking about, for instance, how bad Megalopolis is, which I haven't seen yet because I was hoping to still see it in the theaters, which New Year's Day, he's putting it back in the theaters. I can't wait to see that movie. I was already excited because this man, like Richard, sunk a whole lot of money into this film he's been wanting to make for decades. I don't care if it's bad. Yeah. It's interesting to me. And you were saying many of these things before. and even when we talked about the confusing or confused audience member, I anyway want to see something different, and I think everyone does. But I think a lot of the studios feel like that's not what people want. But when you think about Kate Bush coming out in the UK and having a huge hit with something that, if you looked at it again on paper, you'd be like, "This is insane. This will never hit the charts." And number one with Wuthering Heights, or the earlier songs like Babushka.
Yeah.
And to the low art, bringing you to high art, I discovered Street Hassle by Lou Reed through Up the Academy, which I love, but it's very hard to do a movie club on that because it's one of the most offensive films I think ever made.
Yeah. I've never seen Up the Academy. Of course, I know the film that it was like, Mad Magazine resents Up the Academy.
Yes. Yeah.
But and by the way, because you would probably be the only person who I would say this to. I recently watched for the first time Soul Man, Steve Miner's Soul Man.
Yes.
Which
it's come up on the show for sure.
Okay, I'm sure there probably is an episode right if I scroll. Well, Soul Man has Lou Reed's version. It's him with someone else singing Soul Man.
It's Sam Cooke. I think it's Sam and Lou.
And it's in this sequence where who's the star of Soul Man?
Oh, C. Thomas Howell, or Tommy Howell,
Thomas
he's
Howell
rebranded himself.
Is demonstrating what a bad basketball player he is against a black guy, and it's one of these scenes that. And here's the thing: it's one of the things I actually loved about watching that movie, which is a movie I watched on VHS, by the way, because I had to hook up a VCR. To do some of the video elements for the Vanity Project, and now it's just still hooked up to the TV in my bedroom. And I have a friend who has a big VHS collection, and I was like, "Well, I'm definitely going to have to borrow your copy of Soul Man." It's a movie that is fascinating because it is so wrong. It is so misguided.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is that it actually is sincere. In that it is trying to say something about racism. It's just this white director and this white writer and these white producers and like a 90% white cast like saying this, and it feels so tone deaf now. But if it wasn't sincere, it would be something else. The fact that it is sincere is what makes it interesting, because it's that complication, that sort of confusion about it, where you're like, well, they're actually trying, and you're watching them sort of fall on their face. Mm-hmm. But that's, again, what's so human and humane. I'm certainly not telling anyone to run out and see Soul
No,
Man.
We're not endorsing, and I always have to bring that up. Like, that's why I haven't done a movie club on it, because it's hard to say, like, movie club on Soul Man. It might be a good, like, 2 or 3 picture study into the let's say confused, again for that word, cack-handed and ham-fisted approach to these things. On one end of the spectrum, you have John Hughes with the gong every time Long Duck Dong, even the name appears, and the other things that John Hughes did. And then you have Soul Man, which again is, like you said, very sincere, not earnest, but sincere. And James Earl Jones and Ray Don Chong are in it, and they must have at some point thought this is a worthwhile project.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting because, and I love it that, like, by the way, I've done this whole 6-part documentary series, and I'm glad I'm just got on this podcast to talk to you about Soul Man. But I would rather do nothing.
Let's talk more about it. But I mean, I think that this all shows the background of you. And I want to get into your films as well, because there's a lot of things that we've been talking about that makes me think, oh, that would apply to his horror movies. And then, Soul Man comes up and I just can't help it. But
I can't help myself.
No, don't you apologize. I think we're both equally at fault, and I don't think that there's any problem. So, and by the way, the Soul Man soundtrack is kind of a wild ride. It has that Soul Man. So they made a video. It's Sam and Lou in the studio. I'll send that to you. When I get back in London, I'll send you the soundtrack. There's a couple problematic things in the soundtrack, but before we get back to the podcast, which again, the Vanity Project, go subscribe now, but don't listen until you finish this episode. And how could you? But it's a 6-part series, and I was curious how that came about. Who did you talk to first about it? And you mentioned earlier who you talked to from Severin. So it went from you talking to Severin, in the process of getting this movie restored or found?
Yeah. So, I mean, how it became a thing was that, there were just years would go by and, and I would be gathering information about Student Confidential and about Richard. And then I started to find, make contact with some of the people that made it. I have a friend who cut a movie that David Wasco was the production designer on. David Wasco, at the beginning of his career, production designed Student Confidential. He went on to win the Oscar, and he production designs, Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill, Royal Tenenbaums, a whole bunch of just essential films. And I was able to talk to David and his wife, Sandy, who also worked on the film. And so it was just this sort of ongoing, it was like this other folder on my desktop of just, gathering. And I, again, I've never done any sort of documentary project before. When it really became a thing was after I found Richard, and I decided, with his permission, I would do some phone interviews with him. And I really started to realize what an unusual person he was, what an unusual story he had. And I wasn't even pitching it as a thing. I didn't know what it was going to be. I thought maybe I would write a long article about this. But I have a friend who works at a company called Topic Studios. They've produced a whole bunch of movies. She's the head of the nonfiction department there. I was talking about something with her entirely different. And at the end of the call, I sort of described this thing. And it wasn't a pitch. We're old friends. And so we were just sort of sharing. And
here's my latest obsession. What's your obsession? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I was about 90 seconds into describing this. And she just said, you have to go to his house and film him. And I said, yeah, but who's going to pay for that? And she said, we'll pay for it. And she said, we'll pay for you and a camera person. You just have to put this guy on video. You can't just be recording his audio. And so, so that part of that was when there was actually, someone, basically that was like, it was a paid trip to Tampa for 36 hours, with my friend Jim to shoot. And then what I got there when I met Richard in person, and we interviewed him for over 3 hours. And I learned everything that I learned about the fate of his film elements, about his life, he really, he opened up entirely to me when we met him. I knew leaving that trip that this was something that I had to really do I had to make something. But I played with the idea of doing it as a documentary, but the issue was I didn't want to make something where we were going to cut to scenes from the movie, because I felt there would be this prejudice, that people might feel, they would judge. And the other part of that was that as all of this was happening kind of in slow motion over a few years after I'd gotten in touch with Richard and then started to talk to more people that were involved in the movie, I would see other filmmaker friends, right?
Yeah.
And they would say, what are you working on? And then I would talk about all the sort of writing and directing stuff. And then at some point I would say, there's this other thing. There's this guy. And I would start to describe it. And I realized, because I was so much of a part of this story.
Yeah.
And I love podcasts. And my favorite podcasts are often like the structured, Karina Longworth's podcast, that sort of idea of a prepared script with archival interviews. And it was that I was that much of a part of a story, and that I had been telling this story for so long. That's when I thought this has to be a podcast. So then I thought, well, who's gonna fucking pay for this? Because I can't do this on my own, and I ended up bringing together, Topic Studios, Severin, who I'd already drafted into trying to help me find the film elements. And then I knew Daniel Noah at Spectre Vision, which is the podcast network that the Vanity Project is on, a little bit. And so there was like this Zoom call that I got them all on, and I sort of pitched them, and I explained to them okay, here's the story. Here's what it's going to be like. It's going to be 6 half-hour episodes. It's going to, and I explained topic, you'll get this out of it, Severin, you'll get this out of it, Spectrovision, you'll get this out of it. I just need, and I gave them like a very low figure for a budget. And then I watched them all sort of like the Brady Bunch all talk to one another, and usually when I'm on these calls, if I'm like pitching on a Zoom, as I'm always a director or writer, so they don't have these conversations in front of me, which was interesting. They all said, yeah, I guess we could put up a little bit of money for this. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I got to make this fucking thing. And that was great because, I had become friends with Graham Resnick, who's I produced the podcast with. And Graham is a brilliant filmmaker. He's also a musician, and he is a sound designer. He sound designed all of Ty West's movies. He grew up with Ty. And Graham has a lot of the same tastes that I do. I knew he would be perfect to do this with me. And so it all sort of dovetailed with then working with Severin about that we were going to be able to release the movie again. And that, by the way, is a whole other sort of twin project to this, which is that there's the podcast, which is, the entire story, that's both about Richard, about all his films, about Student Confidential, and this sort of memoir of my growing up as a film freak, and then also this relationship that I developed with him. But the other part of it that I wanted to do was that if this film was going to come out on Blu-ray, I wanted it to be like a Citizen Kane level special edition,
Yeah.
And so I produced these featurettes for it, where a lot of the interviews that I did, I also shot. And so there's the interview that I did with Richard in his home. I created a piece for the Blu-ray that's called Richard Horian Revealed, and it's a bunch of stuff that you do hear in the podcast, but it's other stuff that isn't in there because there's a lot of his story that I couldn't tell in the podcast. I also did this whole making of piece, which is where it's a whole bunch of different people who are interviewed who made the film. And that doesn't have Richard in it because I just wanted them to talk about the making of this film. So he's not in that. And then I had this insane afternoon at Lloyd Kaufman's house where he basically didn't know anything. He had the vaguest recollection of Richard Horian and Student Confidential, and he told me this thing that I captured on my phone that I include in the podcast about. And I guess I could say it here, which is that. What I discovered from him is that because he was friends with Kirk Douglas and Kirk Douglas's son was in the movie, Kirk Douglas called Lloyd Kaufman and said, why don't you distribute this movie? And so the Student Confidential even made it into theaters because no one else was going to distribute it as a favor to Kirk Douglas. But there was that little nugget I got from Lloyd. But what I did for the Blu-ray was I sat Lloyd down and I had someone else do a bunch of research about all the films that they picked up and put in theaters in the 80s. At the same time, they put Student Confidential and some in the 90s. And there's just so many fucking weird movies that they put out that you've never heard of. Yeah. And I'm not talking about the movies that they produced, which I have little to no interest in. These are films that like Student Confidential, like were regional, some of them were like regional productions. There was like a Civil War melodrama called Rebel Love. There was this sort of science fiction movie about astral projection called Dreams Come True that they put out. Like these are really deep cut sort of exploitation films from the 80s and 90s, as well as stuff that people might know, like Combat Shock. If you ever heard of that film, it's like a Staten Island regional 16 millimeter, sort of like no future, sort of incredibly ugly, creepy movie. And then others that people do know, like one of the last movies they put in theaters in the 90s was they put the Dario Argento's The Stendhal Syndrome in.
Oh, right.
which is insane. And then Lloyd Kaufman told me, he's like, "Oh yeah, I used to smoke dope with Dario Argento." So we did this interview with Lloyd, whereas what I said to him is, "Look, this is going to be a lightning round. I just have this list of all these movies." And I would say half of them he remembered, maybe a little bit more. The entire time he was vaping and drinking a Monster Energy drink. And
it's just like me. By the way, this is iced tea. It looks like whiskey because it's a Crown Royal glass, but I am vaping as well. But I like picturing Lloyd doing that.
Yeah. By the way, if with the wood paneling, if it's whiskey, I think that's, it's nice, like, some J&B that you're drinking there.
Yeah,
right?
I know. I shouldn't dispel the notion, especially we're talking about the Giallo sometimes. So, yeah.
Right. But this interview that we did with Lloyd Kaufman was just unbelievable, where he was just spouting stories, what he could barely remember about all these obscure films. And then what we did is we cut it into this piece. It's about 15 minutes. And it's just like, you see a fragment of one of the trailers of one of these, again, these movies that like many of them are never made it to DVD, much less Blu-ray. And then you have him sputtering out some like insane answer about some memory of like, yeah, that guy was a real asshole. Like, and then like, so we did that. And then, there's also, of course, TV spot, trailers. And I did a director's audio commentary for Student Confidential with Richard, which was really, at the end of the day, that was the sort of victory lap that I got to moderate that commentary. And there are some stories he tells on the commentary that wasn't in the podcast. There was only one moment when I buried my head in my hands when he started talking about the weight of one of the actors or one of the actresses. And I was like, my God, Richard, we're not going to be able to edit this out. But anyway, so along with the podcast, which also is on the second disc of this special edition, there's all this other stuff. So this really was like my shrine to Student Confidential that I got to build. I suppose I became the world's expert.
Well, yeah, no, you are the subject matter expert on Richard Horian. And regarding your own work, we were talking before about how many of the restrictions, even though we didn't say it exactly in that way, many of the restrictions that were evident in not just this film, but many of the others, particularly the more low-budget action ones with, the surf rockers and the aliens, and then the commentary from the aliens like Statler and Waldorf.
Yeah, yes.
These wild things jammed together, sometimes out of inspiration and other times out of perspiration, as they say, but is that in and of itself is inspiration as well, because you have to think on your feet, and necessity is the mother of invention. With your films, how have you found working with restrictions, whether they be budgetary or time?
Well, I think if you love horror films, the people who love horror films, I've found, are the people who actually know how movies are made, because there's a bunch of trickery that's going to go into horror in terms of whether that's a special effect. It's like, how was that done? Or at its real, like, sort of like anchor, base sort of value of building suspense, which is, as a young person, when you're watching stuff, if you love horror films and they're scary to you and you keep watching them, you'll understand why they are scary. You'll understand what's happening with where the camera is put and when you cut and what you're hearing in the soundtrack. And so, right hand in hand with that is that because horror has always existed in two worlds of there's sort of studio horror pictures, which right at the birth of the horror genre, that's what it was, Frankenstein and Dracula. These are Universal Pictures. But by the 1950s, all these independent films started to be made. That were like, exploitation, science fiction horror films, and then, straight horror pictures. And then by the time you get to the 70s, there's all these regional horror films that are being made. And there's great fucking movies, all through those decades. As I was watching all of these films, and again, I think this is true of most people who are like, horror fans who end up making their own horror films, you see not only how the building blocks of horror are actually very cheap, like it's about where you put the camera,
Yeah.
and in that, the most affecting horror films often are the cheapest.
Hmm.
Like I saw the original Evil Dead when I was 13 in a movie theater, and that was a transformative experience because the movie looked like the Super 8 films that I had already started making. And the magic of that film is that when you watch it, everything is against it. The acting is not very good. Good, I would say even poor. Because they're young, and and uh, the people making it are amateurs. They don't always know where to put the camera. They don't, but something happens in that film halfway through where you can't stop watching it, and you realize without even knowing it, this movie has become almost miraculously inventive. And then by the time you get to the end, you realize it's a tour de force, right?
Hmm.
So that became a sort of model for me, that movie, which is the idea of like the ideal horror movie for me in a way, it makes something out of nothing, right? And so when I got to make my first feature film, which is called The Pact, um, I wrote it in 5 weeks. I was actually at the coffee shop this morning for the first time in like a few years where I actually wrote that movie. Um, and that film was like, it was almost like a sort of almost Roger Corman type situation where this company that had seen a short film of mine and misinterpreted the short film as a proof of concept film. They thought it was one scene in a larger script, and and so I had a meeting with them, and they said, "Oh, so you have a whole feature script because we're interested in making a feature film, and we really love your short." And I said, well, yes, of course I have a feature script. And of course this is a proof of concept film. And they asked for the script. And I said, I have to do another draft. And then I immediately went and wrote the fucking thing in 5 weeks and gave it to them. And then we were making it 2 months later. And because I had seen enough of these films, that movie it primarily takes place in one location in a house, and I also thought that one of the things that I observed as a fan of horror was that there was this shift that happens um, with this sort of in the middle of the last century in horror, where horror stopped becoming about happening in some other place. Right, it started with Psycho, and then maybe Rosemary's Baby is the best example of this. That if you told a horror story in a real place, it somehow could be even more affecting.
Well, The Exorcist is a great example too. The realism, the
Yeah,
house, everything except those scenes that are not, but that's been couched in extreme realism, so they're even scarier.
yeah, exactly. And then that was a hugely affecting movie for me, especially as being raised a Catholic. Um, but yeah, and so my thought with that first movie was like, well, let's tell a ghost story, but let's do it in what looks like a very average house. And so The Pact is a movie that took place in a sort of ranch style. It's like the kind of house that you could find in a million different neighborhoods in Southern California. And I didn't hide that it was Southern California. We set it actually south of LA. The whole idea was that it would feel real, so all of those choices came from being a horror fan, um, and so, and really, like, even when I made my studio film, which was called The Prodigy, which was a movie I didn't write, it was, and every director I know says the same thing. It's like no matter what you're making, it always feels like a low budget movie. Like it's like you're always just up against the clock. You just have like different tools. Like I remember on that movie, there's like a climactic scene that I decided I wanted to set it in a dying orchard. This was this idea that I put into the script. So we're shooting in like March in Toronto in this freezing cold orchard, and it's like it's like we're the mud like up to our like fucking knees, and we had this giant telescoping camera mount because we wanted to do these special shots. but it all just came down to, Taylor and Jackson, the two actors, just having this moment where she's holding a gun to this kid, and is she going to pull the trigger? And it didn't matter all this shit that we had brought out there. Like none of it mattered. It just was like that the actors, if they were just going to deliver, and that's always what it just comes down to, So, and again, if I hadn't been such a fan of horror films, and knowing how cheap some of the most effective ones are, I don't know if I would have been able to, to understand that in that moment. That's all we needed is just this one thing, So.
And in a different genre, if there's a car chase, you really only care if you care about the characters. It could be a wonderfully technically beautiful car chase, but it doesn't matter unless you care about them, which is where foul play falls apart. But
I need to see that. I know you did a podcast on that, didn't you?
I did. It was a combo foul play seems like old times thing, because they did a double feature at the New Beverly, which by the way, at New Beverly, I got to see the Argento all-nighter, and I'd never seen Tenebrae before. And when that unspooled at, I don't know, 4 a.m. or something, it was one of the greatest moments I've ever had in cinema, because as you said, and I think we alluded to both, having almost no context, and my favorite thing is to go in blind with a movie. I want to not know a thing, which I was able to do even with one battle after another, and getting thumbs up for that movie. See, even Riverside likes that movie, and you're just plunged into something. And in terms of confusion, the first Cassavetes movie I saw was Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and it's so great. And I was pulled in, but I just thought, what is this? Yeah. And anytime I can feel that with a film after seeing countless films, as with you, that's something special. And I want to know more about what's going on there. And that led to me being obsessed with him.
Yeah.
I would like to mention a couple other things about the corollaries between Richard's character in the film. What's his character again? It's Michael
Drake. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Michael Drake. Was that his house, his actual house in the film?
No. So, Richard told me that he lived in a, he had some penthouse that he was renting in Beverly Hills when he was in Los Angeles. But no, that was a Tudor mansion, also in Beverly Hills. And David Waska, the production designer, said that they did very little to it. So it was some rich person's house when they just shot in. True to being a low budget movie, they just said, well, we can shoot here. And by the way, when you're making a movie, that's the best thing, which is that if you don't have to do anything to the location. Yeah. But yeah, it was a Tudor mansion. I actually haven't found that Tudor mansion. I've been to the school. I didn't walk into the school because they probably would have arrested me. It's like, and it's actually one of the things that's so funny about this film is that, besides the Tudor mansion, there are some exteriors on Melrose, very close to actually the New Beverly. There's some on La Brea. But then aside from that, they built all the interior sets in the school. So all the sort of apartments that the kids are but even including the orgy scene when the girls go to these nefarious guys who are, there to kind of take advantage of them, where we have a bunch of nudity. And I should mention, by the way, Craig, and when I was scrolling through your podcast and seeing that it was, fairly queer centric, and I was looking forward to talking about the absolute lack of any gay subtext in this film. The truth is, there are dicks in this movie, right? There is male nudity, which is a surprise, but
big surprise.
For an 80s movie. And, full frontal. But one of those scenes, which is this kind of orgy scene, that was shot in an elementary school. That was shot in a grade school. So right now there are some kids, as we speak, learning about, something and they have no idea that this was being in 1985, what was going on in that classroom.
Also, Richard's anger that comes across in certain moments in the podcast, which is clearly, again, one sourced, I would imagine, from the trials and tribulations of the inability to express oneself or, pushing through that barrier and then feeling rejected. In the film, Michael Drake has these incredible outbursts that you do not predict based on his geniality and very businesslike deportment. However, that's hinted at with his yelling at a business on a business call, and also instructing Ronnie Blakely's secretary character to use whatever means necessary, like intimidation and all that. But that scene in particular, the nude scene, if you want, spoiler avert, people, skip the next minute. When there's the nude scene, it's after he catches his wife in flagrante delicto, much like the scene with Craig Wasson in Body Double. But unlike in that movie where we see Barbara Crampton nude,
temporary.
Yeah, exactly. When we see Crampton naked, we don't see the guy. And he walks out of bed. He's like, get the hell out of here. And not only is the guy nude, he gets like slammed in the solar plexus, kicked. I mean, the violence, though we don't see the below the frame violence, it's extreme, as is the violence later on. There's a rage that just explodes. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, too, the folks who were laughing at the movie, I imagine those people like a bunch of maniacs and degenerates I saw laughing through To Live and Die in LA until that very special moment. And they were like, because what do you think of this? This thing, we've all experienced this to a certain degree. It's something I think has gotten worse in the last few years. This super irony, devoted, I'm smarter than this movie, a determination to laugh at something before they even know what it is.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about, and as regard to that scene in Student Confidential, I think it's a reflection of Richard. He had said to be, and I think he says this on the BluRay, that he said I would have cut that scene out now, because he said that's not who the counselor really is. But then when he watched the movie again, he told me he feels differently about it. But it's an exceptional scene because it does feel like something out of a Scorsese movie or something. It's so violent and shocking that this guy is completely naked and getting this shit out of him. Like, it's very weird. As far as, I mean, I guess, and this is maybe a good place to sort of, that we're circling around to end, because we talked a lot about this sort of interfacing with these sort of strange or broken movies and how we take them very seriously, as much as that we can find things to like, that we find that we're sort of laughing at an element or something is dated. I think, like, my sense is it's probably cyclical. For me, it was Mystery Science Theater that kind of fucked up shit in theaters for a while. And I know that at the end of the 90s, Tarantino, he did this like a series of film screenings at the Alamo Drafthouse in Austin. And I wasn't there for these, but I remember reading like a sort of report about them. And I guess before he would show like a double feature of Grindhouse movies, and this is, well before he made the movie Grindhouse, he would kind of try to educate the crowd about maybe a way to look at it. And he would say something like, when you watch this, try not to root against the movie. Don't go into this thinking that you're there just to laugh at this, and that's the only way to interact with it. See what happens when you root for the movie. And I found that, like, and actually in particular with a lot of the 1970s Grindhouse movies that I remember seeing at the New Beverly when the movie Grindhouse was released, in Tarantino. This is when I'm not sure he had actually, I don't think he was the owner of it yet, but I think he was just about to buy it. He screened 2 full months of just 1970s Grindhouse films. And this is before I had a kid. This is before I had a career of any kinds. And I would just go there with a friend of mine, and we would see anywhere between like 5 and 7 movies a week. And I remember, by the way, when the schedule was released, I was like, oh, I can't wait to see a bunch of my favorites. And then I looked to see it, and I was like, what the fuck are these movies? Like, I've never heard any of this shit. Like, because it was that, incredibly deep cut Tarantino. And what I discovered at like watching those films, so many of those movies, was that, like, there was enough people there who sort of, they understood the task at hand is like, enjoy yourself and laugh at something that's ridiculous, but these movies can show you something transcendent. Sometimes it's by accident, but often it's by intention. And once you get into that mindset of being forgiving, it can really open up a whole different sort of way to look at films that you might think you're just supposed to laugh at. I actually remember vividly one of the double features. It was sort of some of the more, I guess, there was a double feature that was more. This is on the popular scale of that series. They showed the movie Rolling Thunder, which I absolutely love that film. And they showed it with the original film that AIP put it out in drive-ins with, which was The Town That Dreaded Sundown. And so everyone sat through Rolling Thunder, and that's a movie that people take very seriously, you know.
Yeah.
And then The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Have you seen The Town That Dreaded Sundown?
I've been meaning to for ages.
Okay. Well, the tone of that film is so bizarre. It switches between this sort of cornpone Southern, you know, Dukes of Hazzard sort of comedy with really grisly and disturbing, dark, unpleasant violence. And it's a true crime story. It's totally the most confusing movie. And I remember sitting there at the New Beverly, and there were some guys behind me who were like
yucking it up.
Movie started, and because like the dumb comedy in it was so bad, and they were laughing at the movie, and then even the scenes that were happening, you know, outside of those scenes, they were finding things to laugh at that, and you know, they were right behind me, and I'm just sitting there, you know, and then there was this like kind of fucked up murder scene, and they got kind of quiet, you know, and then there's another scene with some dumb humor or something that was really awkward, and then they, you know, laughed again, and then there's the scene in the movie where the killer ties someone up. We're outside. It's a night for night exterior, so it's really grainy and just gross looking, and he ties a knife to the end of his trombone. And he plays the trombone by moving that slide and stabs this person. It's just this incredibly surreal and upsetting image. There's no music to it other than this trombone going like, you know?
Oh man!
And just the sound of like, you know, crickets, and the whole audience was silent. And after that scene, those three guys behind me said, "Fuck this, let's get out of here." And they just like left. And I was like, the movie is too strong for them. Like they didn't know how to interface with this thing. And I just thought that was a great example of like, just let this thing be. And, you know, and don't feel like you need to press on it to get this one thing out of it. And so some of the most transcendent experiences I had in the movie theater were during that very series, because I saw so many movies that would, you know, send me back and forth between these two different poles. And again, Student Confidential, because it's a good place maybe for us to end.
Yeah, definitely.
Is a movie that did that for me, but almost in slow motion over decades as I got to know the heart of this film, you know.
Because there definitely are hilarious moments. The extended, let's say, shower scene in the school. There's certain things you're like, this is going on, and this is going on. And that's funny. And it also kind of speaks to perhaps Richard's analytical assessment of what a film of this era for this audience needed. And yet it just goes on and on and on. But then it you know, quickly shifts back. And to close, I'd like to say, as we've been alluding to, not only is it a drag for those of us who are trying to just watch a movie, I think people really rob themselves of the potential to experience something that they are not familiar with. And I know that there's a lot of times, like even Cassavetes said, people go into a movie, something different, they go, no, I don't want to feel anything different. I hate this. You really rob yourself if you go into a film with that premise. And one last thing, I love when I'm hearing the idiot laughers, the chuckleheads, and I'm like, oh yeah, just wait. 20 minutes in, it's like you can't avoid how terrifying or bleak this film is. So you folks enjoy, and then there'll be a quiet that settles over, and they're even more disturbed than anyone else that might be disturbed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So if you want a non-disturbing but uplifting and fascinating show. Check out the Vanity Project. Links are in the description. Or if you're already searching it and saving it now, that's cool. And Nicholas, I look forward to talking to you more about your films, and maybe we'll pick a film to focus on, like Eyes of Laura Mars, something like that. And till next time.
Great to talk to you, Craig.
And you,
One
Nicholas.
day in person, we'll do it too.
Absolutely. I look forward to that.